Hello, everyone. Now, I know that it's hard to keep up on top of what's going on in the Holy Land, but if you want to know more about what's happening here in Israel, I'm Aaron Porras, and this is the Weekly Review.
With less than 2 weeks until the country heads to elections, Prime Minister Netanyahu is trying to make the most of what could be his last days in office, or at least use of these last days to get a few more seats for his Likud party and get reelected. Netanyahu was due to fly this morning to the United Arab Emirates for a historic visit, the first of its kind by an Israeli prime minister, and to reinforce the new normalization deal between Abu Dhabi and Jerusalem. He had also reportedly planned to meet Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, a huge feat for an Israeli leader. Now his trip has been canceled, according to officials, after Jordan blocked the flight from entering its airspace. While the connection hasn't been confirmed, earlier today a Jordanian prince was denied entry to Jerusalem's Temple Mount over the size of his security delegation. All right, moving along. After elections in the Gaza Strip, Yahya Sinwar will continue to head Hamas in the Strip for a second term. Facing intense competition against rival Nizar Awadallah, sources reporting that Sinwar won 167 out of 320 votes in Gaza's Shura Council.
هذا الشعب يخرج اليوم ليؤكد تمسكه بأرضه بحقوقه بثوابته بحقه في العودة. الشعور لا يوصف حقيقة يعني.
Sinwar's second win reflecting his strong control over both the political and military wings of the Islamist organization Hamas. Sinwar's first win coming in 2017 following his release from a 2011 prisoner swap with Israel, where he spent more than 20 years behind bars on charges that included killing suspected informants against Palestinian militants. Critics say although elections are held in Gaza, the system is corrupt and results do not necessarily reflect the true politics of Gaza residents. Well, it's been 5 whole days since Israel launched its Green Passport program, allowing Israelis who have been vaccinated to enjoy a return to normal life, like going to restaurants, hotels, and movie theaters. The Prime Minister yesterday taking a stroll through Bat Yam, taking photos with passers-by and even congratulating a couple getting married. But according to the Jerusalem Post, it might be a bit longer until Israel's green passports are valid in other countries, as Israel is far ahead of other nations in its vaccine drive. Meanwhile, Israel's health minister has approved a plan to give returnees from abroad electronic bracelets to ensure they don't break quarantine. The country will hand out 5,000 in the next week alone. Let's take a look at the latest numbers. The health ministry recorded 2,802 new cases on Wednesday, and the infection rate has gone down to 2.9%. There are 645 Israelis in serious condition, with 211 on ventilators. The death toll is 5,955. More than 5 million Israelis have had one dose of the vaccine, and 3.9 million have had one.
Israeli elections 2021, the 4th national vote in 2 years, finally kicking off with absentee ballot boxes opening tonight around the world. So yeah, this is real now. Israeli diplomats, embassy staffers, and their families living abroad set to begin the voting tonight in Israel's 4th serial Knesset elections. And the first of these 4,000-some ballots are being cast in Wellington, New Zealand at around 10 p.m. Israel time. But following the Kiwis, 103 other stations across 100 other missions will open too, including in 4 new outposts between Morocco, Bahrain, and the UAE. And the voting window will be open for 48 hours. Non-diplomats living abroad, on the other hand, will have to fly in by the end of the month, as Israeli law requires all private citizens to be physically present in the country to cast their votes on voting day. As for the election's outcome, while it's still too early to tell, few are optimistic. A new survey from the Israeli Democracy Institute finding that just 29%, less than a third of Israelis, believe that the election will end the years of political deadlock. And the newest polls, shifting slightly overnight, seem to back up voters' fears, with Prime Minister Netanyahu's Likud party staying in the lead at 29 seats, followed by Yesh Atid, Yamina, and the New Hope parties with 20 seats, 11 seats, and 9, respectively. And neither left nor right-leaning parties then reaching a 61-seat majority needed to form a stable government. Still, the battle far from over, politicians continuing to hit the campaign trail hard. Prime Minister Netanyahu, for one, reaching out to English-speaking voters overnight in another recent interview, during which time he mercilessly attacked his opposition as inexperienced and incapable, while defending his own career and policies. Among many topics, Netanyahu taking pride in his achievements like Israel's vaccinations drive, the historic Abraham Peace Accords, and international efforts to push back on Iran. all while rejecting allegations of corruption and of promoting or tolerating racist policy in the right-wing bloc. Then Netanyahu also responding to new high court ruling on conversions, pointing to his liberal history on accepting conversions, but adding that we must still defend against fake conversions that could put the identity of the country at risk.
I think we can solve the problem of conversion for all streams and all denominations in Judaism, but we also have to protect the borders of Israel so that we're not overrun. And I think we can find a balance between the two.
Reform and conservative leaders, however, are condemning the prime minister for insinuating that their movements could be abused by asylum seekers or foreign workers to illegally and illegitimately convert for the sake of citizenship. Now, moving on, just 15 days left before Israel's 2021 Knesset elections. But despite heading back to the polls for the fourth time in just 2 years, many of the parties in the running are either new or renewed. So we thought it'd be a good idea to remind you what the different factions stand for, and we begin with the ultra-Orthodox Shas and United Torah Judaism parties. Currently serving with 9 and 7 Knesset seats respectively, ultra-Orthodox parties Shas and United Torah Judaism together form what Israelis commonly call the religious Knesset bloc. But while often lumped together as a right-wing pair for continuing to sit with the Netanyahu coalitions, the two parties do differ on some policies, and they represent different swaths of the Jewish Israeli electorate, neither traditionally left nor right. Shas, for one, led by Interior Minister Aryeh Deri, was founded as the party for Sephardic or Middle Eastern Jews, and many of its voters are traditional, modern Orthodox, and ultra-Orthodox in practice, with Shas campaigning on protecting the religious and cultural heritage of Sephardic Jewry overall. To that end, Shas has worked with parties across the spectrum, establishing government-funded religious education systems in poor Sephardic towns, opposing the division of Jerusalem, pushing for increased Jewish religious law in Israel, advocating for living an ultra-Orthodox lifestyle, and opposing Israeli settlement freezes in Judea and Samaria or the West Bank. United Torah Judaism, or UTJ, meanwhile, was until recently led by Housing Minister and former Health Minister Yaakov Litzman, but it's now under Moshe Gafni's leadership. And as a conglomerate of two smaller parties, UTJ mostly represents Ashkenazi or European Haredi Jews' interests, like preserving the religious Jewish legal authority in Israel. UTJ differs from Shas, however, in that it characterizes itself as a generally non-Zionist party, with more concern for religion than security or diplomacy. For example, UTJ was party to the 2005 Gaza disengagement and has no uniform opinion on Israeli settlements in the West Bank. Still, UTJ and Shas do greatly influence one another and more often than not vote together, which brings us to the controversies that both parties face. For one, both Shas and UTJ have a long history with corruption charges. Former UTJ chair Yaakov Litzman is being accused of manipulating the psych evaluations for alleged rapist Malka Leifer, and police recommending indictments against Shas head Aryeh Deri in 2018 after he already served time in prison for similar charges in 2000. Meanwhile, the public largely blaming the Haredi sector for a lag in Israel's coronavirus response and growing misinformation campaign. Former Health Minister Yaakov Litzman himself falling ill after breaking quarantine restrictions last year, while Shas was fined by the Elections Committee for handing out prayer cards at polling stations that claimed to cure coronavirus and other illnesses. Then social policies not winning many popularity contests either, both parties abjectly opposing any public expression of homosexuality, rejecting the court's recognition of gay marriages performed abroad, and also rejecting the role of women in politics, arguing that Jewish law dictates the separation of gender roles. And finally, most recently, both parties are fighting hard to reverse the court's recognition of non-ultra-Orthodox conversions to Judaism, UTJ having even run a campaign ad over the weekend likening non-Haredi Jewish converts to dogs. Now, with 14 days left ahead of Israel's 2021 Knesset elections, we continue with the second installment of our Knesset parties breakdown. And today, we'll be looking to the Arab Israeli factions vying for your vote, the Joint Arab List and the United Arab List, or RAM. Activist, communist, feminist, pragmatist, extremist? Arab Israeli Knesset members have been given a lot of titles, some earned, some self-proclaimed, and some completely false or misleading. But the sheer array of differing opinions present in the current Arab parties is part of what makes categorizing their ideology so complex. But currently there are 4 Arab Israeli parties, Balad, Hadash, Tal, and the United Arab List, or RAM. and until recently they were all unified under the title of the Joint Arab List, with Hadash chairman Ayman Odeh at the helm, a decision first made in 2015 that earned them 15 seats in Knesset and made them the third largest party behind Yesh Atid and the Likud. The platform, meanwhile, supported by many Israeli Arabs and Bedouin citizens, largely focusing on two main topics. First being Israeli Arab life in Israel, with policies including separation of religion and state, exempting Arabs from IDF service, which they already are, and increasing budget for Arab-Israeli community issues like lack of housing, combating violence, and subsidizing Muslim, Christian, and Druze holy places. Then the second topic, Palestinian affairs, including Israeli withdrawal to the pre-1967 borders, the creation of a Palestinian state with East Jerusalem as its capital, and the dismantlement of Israeli settlements, in addition to the extending of the right of return to Israel for Palestinian refugees and their descendants, which most Israelis consider to be an attack on the very fabric of Israeli society. In fact, the party has often been embroiled in controversy, with most other parties refusing to even consider including the Arab list in a coalition. And this as list members are accused of anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism, and supporting terrorism. Most notably when former member Hanin Zoabi attempted to break Israel's maritime blockade around Gaza in 2014, or when former member Jamal Zahalka was accused of supplying intelligence to the Hezbollah terror group, or when former member Basil Ghatas was arrested for supplying contraband cell phones to convicted Palestinian terrorists in prison. And the Central Elections Committee has multiple times disqualified members or whole factions from the joint list from elections, only to be typically overturned by the High Court. So now fast forward to today, and the political climate has shifted dramatically. Many of the supposedly more problematic members are gone, and the fairly consistent focus on Palestinian rights at the apparent expense of the local Arabs is starting to turn around. But Arab voter turnout already expected to be at an all-time low. And to make matters worse, due to both ideological differences and party term limits, the disillusioned Arab vote is now splitting further. This as the Ram party has split off for a solo run. Ram chairman Mansour Abbas, seen as a religious pragmatist, explaining that his faction will be better off untethered. And already he's been hard at work trying to separate his party as being more moderate by meeting with the Likud, hosting committee meetings on local issues, and breaking with the majority of the rest of the joint list by voting against them in the Knesset on issues like banning sexual orientation conversion therapy for LGBT individuals. Still, Ram is now expected to fail to even get into the Knesset, polling with just 2.6% of the vote, while the remaining joint list parties are expected to drop from 11 seats to 8. Speaking of elections, with 13 days left now ahead of Israel's March 23 vote, we move on to our third daily installment of ILTV's Knesset Parties Breakdown. And today we're moving on to the personal political party of Avigdor Lieberman, Israel Beitenu. Chana Rifkin reports.
Once hailed as one of Israel's top political leaders, Avigdor Lieberman is a household name, but repeated elections in the last 2 years have been rough on the chairman of the Yisrael Beitenu party, which is now polling in the middle of the pack with an estimated 7 seats. Now, Lieberman, an immigrant from the former Soviet Union, founded the party in 1999, and the majority of its voters come from Israel's large Russian immigrant population. But the party's policy has always been based on the revisionist Zionism of Zev Jabotinsky, including the principles of national unity, preserving Israel as the nation-state of the Jewish people, and no citizenship without allegiance. For example, pushing for compulsive military or civilian national service for all Israeli citizens. The party then also supports free market economic policies, financial incentives for business, small government, and a Palestinian peace plan that involves the transfer of both land and population. And Lieberman appearing to only seldomly waver from these positions. Still, as with nearly any party, Lieberman and his faction are not without controversy. For one, Lieberman faced charges of money laundering, witness tampering, breach of trust, fraud, and corruption, for which he was acquitted, but still hurt his standing at the polls in 2015. Meanwhile, Lieberman has a complicated history of withdrawing from or dissolving Israeli coalitions, beginning in 2008 when he left Ehud Olmert's coalition in protest against concessions offered to the PA. Then in 2014, Lieberman dissolved his party's union with the Likud over the handling of Operation Protective Edge. And in 2018, while acting defense minister, Lieberman again resigned from the Likud government in protest against a ceasefire with Hamas. And this essentially brings us to today, where Lieberman was considered a kingmaker, and his party had the ability in 2019 to make or break a coalition. But when his demands over military conscription weren't met, he chose to block the forming of a government, sending us back to elections. And since then, he's been in the opposition, vowing never to sit with Prime Minister Netanyahu again.
Now, in related news, Israel is setting a global example for how to vaccinate its population and battle the coronavirus, and world leaders are still paying close attention. The Hungarian and Czech prime ministers, for one, will meet Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu this Thursday to discuss how to effectively fight COVID-19. Europe is currently in the midst of a third wave of the coronavirus, and these two countries are especially hard hit. Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban's press chief saying that, quote, the main topic of the meeting will be the effort to curb the pandemic. Meanwhile, on Monday, Netanyahu met with Brazilian Minister of Foreign Affairs Ernesto Araújo, as well as with member of the Brazilian Chamber of Deputies Eduardo Bolsonaro. And according to the Prime Minister's office, they discussed the global battle against the coronavirus and opportunities for cooperation between Israel and Brazil in this area, as well as bolstering of capabilities in both countries for research and development of vaccines against future diseases. Then additionally, just last week, Denmark and Austria agreeing to join forces with Israel by investing in research and vaccines against new waves of mutations of the virus. But that's not all. According to a report from Kan Public Broadcaster on Monday, Israel is planning to renew its program to supply surplus coronavirus vaccines to foreign countries. According to the report, Israel is negotiating with 20 different countries, including Cyprus, Hungary, the Maldives, Ethiopia, Uganda, and Guatemala, and with Moderna to send up to 100,000 vaccines abroad.
Well, as the world watches Israel return to normalcy, some are looking to follow the same path. Israel's prime minister announcing over the weekend that Israel, Austria, and Denmark will establish a joint fund for research and development of COVID-19 vaccines. Netanyahu holding a press conference with Austria's chancellor and Denmark's prime minister at his side during a visit over the weekend. Take a look.
I think this is great news, and I think it reflects the respect we have for each other and the belief, the confidence that we have in working together to protect the health of our peoples.
We have agreed today to bring our knowledge together in a kind of a collective effort to secure better and also more reliable access to vaccines. Therefore, as we have already said, we will bolster our research and development cooperation.
I would like to thank you, Bibi, and you, Mette, for this cooperation, because I think that it is important to work together in order not only to fight the virus now, but also to fight the mutations in the next years.
We begin tonight with unfortunate news of 2 attempted stabbings, the IDF stopping the suspected terror attacks overnight and this morning. First, residents of the Sde Ephraim farm reporting an attacker armed with a knife trying to stab the farm owner's wife. The attacker was neutralized by residents of the farm, however, and security forces have since taken over. Meanwhile, this just hours after Israeli troops conducting an arrest raid Sunday night in the Palestinian city of Tubas. There, a suspect attempted to stab one of the soldiers during the raid. Thankfully, though, the soldier only sustained a light hand injury and was treated on the spot. The assailant, on the other hand, unfortunately, was likewise shot and neutralized. Israeli police arresting 4 Galilee residents this week suspected of helping 2 other suspects escape custody last week. The 2 main suspects having allegedly attacked an IDF Egoz unit commando and stolen his weapon last Wednesday. But IDF footage of the raid showing a bird's-eye view of the action, police ending a long and complicated investigation with the arrest of all the targeted subjects and the recovering of both the stolen weapon and its ammunition. Still, as for the soldier who was attacked, while the IDF is praising him for promptly reporting the incident, the commander of the elite Egoz unit is condemning his apparent weakness, telling the rest of the unit that a soldier who doesn't know how to defeat 2 enemies in battle and has his weapon snatched away cannot belong to Egoz, adding that even in combat, I will not accept a POW unless, God forbid, he's a corpse. For weeks now, tensions continuing to rise between the United States and Israel and Iran. But Israel and the United States now teaming up in a show of force against the Ayatollahs in Tehran. Israeli F-15 fighter jets seen escorting 2 American B-52 bombers through Israeli airspace on Sunday. And this shows strength coming after multiple alleged Iran-linked attacks targeted at the U.S. and Israel across the world. Recent attacks including several missile strikes on American military bases in Iraq and an attack on an Israeli-owned ship in the Gulf of Oman. Though according to the United States military, the patrol flight was intended mostly just to deter future aggressions and to reassure American allies of the United States' military commitment to maintaining security in the region.
Meanwhile, Israel had another special guest over the weekend, this time not on the ground, but in the sky. Pope Francis sent a message to Israel's President Rivlin as he crossed over Israel en route to Baghdad from Rome on his 4-day historic visit to the country, the first visit by a pontiff to Iraq.
To His Excellency Reverend Rivlin, President of the State of Israel, entering Israeli airspace on my apostolic journey to Iraq, I send warm greetings to you and the people of the nation, praying that Almighty God will bless all with His gift of harmony and peace. Franciscus, Papa.
Now, in related news, Israel is setting a global example for how to vaccinate its population and battle the coronavirus, and world leaders are still paying close attention. The Hungarian and Czech prime ministers, for one, will meet Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu this Thursday to discuss how to effectively fight COVID-19. Europe is currently in the midst of a third wave of the coronavirus, and these two countries are especially hard hit. Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban's press chief saying that, quote, the main topic of the meeting will be the effort to curb the pandemic. Meanwhile, on Monday, Netanyahu met with Brazilian Minister of Foreign Affairs Ernesto Araújo, as well as with member of the Brazilian Chamber of Deputies Eduardo Bolsonaro. And according to the Prime Minister's office, they discussed the global battle against the coronavirus and opportunities for cooperation between Israel and Brazil in this area, as well as bolstering of capabilities in both countries for research and development of vaccines against future diseases. Then additionally, just last week, Denmark and Austria agreeing to join forces with Israel by investing in research and vaccines against new waves of mutations of the virus. But that's not all. According to a report from Kan Public Broadcaster on Monday, Israel is planning to renew its program to supply surplus coronavirus vaccines to foreign countries. According to the report, Israel is negotiating with 20 different countries, including Cyprus, Hungary, the Maldives, Ethiopia, Uganda, and Guatemala, and with Moderna to send up to 100,000 vaccines abroad. All right, finally, major news for the Israeli pop sensation Noah Kirel. The teenage Kirel getting set to both produce and star in a coming Hollywood film. Kirel reportedly wrote the film with her team and pitched it to American producers, eventually getting it picked up by the Picture Start production company. And the film apparently telling the story of a young woman in a globe-spanning escapist event. But the news marks yet another major international achievement for the 19-year-old star following Kirel's multi-million-dollar music deal with Atlantic Records. Additionally, Atlantic Records is set to produce the soundtrack for the coming film. This as Kirel simultaneously works to finish her debut international album and single with that same label. And that's it for ILTV's Weekly Review. I'm Aaron Porras. See you next week.